quiet afternoon in the heart of a dense, sunlit forest. The air was crisp, the golden rays of sunlight filtered through the thick canopy, and birds chirped melodiously. Everything seemed peaceful, idyllic even. But for Clara, a young hiker exploring the unfamiliar trails, the serenity was deceptive. Something felt off. She had ventured into the woods seeking solace, a break from the chaos of her busy city life. Her map dangled uselessly from her hand as she marveled at the beauty of her surroundings. Yet, there was an undercurrent of unease she couldn't shake. The silence, though punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves or call of a bird, seemed unnatural, too heavy. As she trekked deeper, she noticed something peculiar. The forest, vibrant and full of life moments ago, seemed to change. The birdsong ceased, the wind stilled, and an eerie hush settled around her. It wasn't just the absence of sound that unnerved her. It was the distinct feeling of being watched. Her heartbeat quickened, her breath shallow, and that's when she saw it. Emerging from the thicket, a large gray wolf stepped onto the trail ahead of her, its piercing amber eyes locking onto hers. Clara froze, every fiber of her being screaming to run, but the wolf didn't attack. Instead, it stood there, unmoving, its gaze both warning and protective. What was this creature doing here? And why did it seem like it wasn't the real threat? Clara's heart raced as questions flooded her mind. Little did she know, this encounter would lead to a chain of events that would change her life forever, and reveal a terror far greater than she could have ever imagined. The forest had transformed into something unrecognizable. What had once been a haven of vibrant life was now cloaked in a suffocating stillness. The towering trees, their bark etched with years of growth, seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward Clara. The sunlight, which moments ago had painted the forest floor with warmth, now filtered through the canopy in fractured, pale beams that seemed cold and sterile. Clara's breath hitched as the weight of the silence pressed against her. She felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting, watching. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to retrace her steps and run back to the trailhead, but her feet refused to move. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the wolf standing before her, its massive frame silhouetted against the golden haze of the afternoon. The wolf's presence was both a comfort and a threat. It hadn't attacked, yet its posture spoke of a readiness to spring. Its eyes, glowing like molten amber, seemed to pierce into her very soul, as if it knew something she didn't. Clara's chest tightened with unease. Her thoughts raced. Why is it just standing there? Is it warning me or protecting me? And then, as if on cue, the faintest sound reached her ears. A rustle, barely perceptible but unmistakably close. She spun toward the noise, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The undergrowth swayed, though no breeze stirred. Whatever it wasn't the wind. The wolf let out a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down Clara's spine. She wasn't alone, and the danger wasn't ahead of her. It was all around. The realization was like ice in her veins, and for the first time, she understood that something far more sinister was lurking in the daylight. Clara had always been drawn to the untamed beauty of nature. A freelance wildlife photographer, she had spent countless days chasing sunsets over vast meadows and capturing fleeting glimpses of rare animals. To her, the wilderness wasn't just a passion. It was her refuge. After losing her mother 2 years ago to a sudden illness, Clara had thrown herself into her work, using the solitude of the wild to escape the crushing weight of her grief. But there was something about this particular trip that felt different. Her heart wasn't in it, not fully. The forest, with its towering pines and endless thickets, felt less like a haven and more like an enigma. She had come here hoping to rekindle her love for photography, but all she felt was a growing unease she couldn't shake. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the subtle warnings from the locals who had told her to stay on the marked trails. She had laughed it off, thinking they were just superstitious stories meant to keep tourists out of trouble. But now, standing face to face with the wolf, she wasn't so sure. The wolf was unlike anything she'd seen before. It wasn't just its size. It was the way it carried itself, regal and commanding. Its coat was a mix of silvery gray and deep black, shimmering in the fractured sunlight. Clara couldn't help but feel it was more than just an animal. It had a presence, a sentience in its gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. Her hand instinctively went to the camera slung around her neck, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. Photography had always been her shield, a way to put distance between herself and the world, to observe without being involved. She lifted the camera, the lens clicking into place as she framed the wolf in her viewfinder. But the moment she looked through the lens, the wolf let out a sharp bark-like sound, startling her. Its eyes locked onto hers, and she lowered the camera, a strange pang of guilt blooming in her chest. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Clara wasn't alone on this trip, at least not initially. Her younger brother, Alex, had been with her until yesterday, when he decided to cut the trip short. He'd claimed it was because of work, but Clara knew better. Alex had been unsettled from the moment they'd arrived, constantly looking over his shoulder and jumping at every sound. He'd begged her to leave with him, but Clara had refused. Now, standing in the eerie stillness of the forest, she wished she'd listened. As her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, Clara became acutely aware of the wolf's body language. Its ears were perked, its muscles tense, its nose twitching as if it sensed something she couldn't. For the first time, she realized that the wolf wasn't looking at her. It was watching something behind her. Fear clawed its way up her spine. Whatever was out there, the wolf knew. And it wasn't here for the trees, the sunlight, or the quiet beauty of the forest. It was here for her. Clara's breath hitched as she turned to glance over her shoulder. The forest stretched endlessly behind her, sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden streams. At first glance, there was nothing unusual, just the same trees, the same moss-covered ground, and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. But the wolf's unwavering gaze told her otherwise. Something or someone was out there. "Stay calm," she muttered to herself, her voice trembling. But calm wasn't an option. Her instincts screamed at her to run. But where? She didn't even know what she was running from. The wolf stepped forward, positioning itself between her and whatever lay hidden in the shadows. Its head lowered slightly, a deep growl rumbling from its chest. Clara froze. Was it protecting her or warning her? Okay. Think, she whispered, clutching her camera tightly as if it could somehow shield her. A sudden crack broke the silence, a branch snapping underfoot. Clara whipped around, her heart pounding in her ears. This time she saw it. A fleeting shadow, too tall and too fast to be an animal, darting between the trees. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the forest. There was no answer, just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow her words whole. The wolf's growl deepened, its stance growing more aggressive. Without thinking, Clara took a step back, her foot catching on a root. She stumbled, falling to the ground. The impact knocked the air from her lungs, and her camera clattered beside her. The shadow reappeared, closer this time. Clara caught a glimpse of something she couldn't quite comprehend. Dark, sinewy, and moving unnaturally fast. Her pulse raced as adrenaline surged through her veins. Scrambling to her feet, she grabbed a fallen branch, clutching it like a weapon. "Stay back," she yelled, though she doubted her words carried any weight. The wolf barked sharply, a sound so commanding that it startled even Clara. Then, without warning, it lunged forward, disappearing into the trees after the shadow. "No!" Clara cried, her voice cracking. She didn't know why she cared, why she felt a surge of panic at the thought of the wolf leaving her. But as the sound of snapping branches and snarls filled the air, she realized something terrifying. She was completely alone now. Her mind raced. She needed to get out of the forest, back to the safety of her car. But which direction? Every tree looked the same, every path indistinguishable from the last. Then she saw it, a glint of sunlight reflecting off metal. Her camera. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just her tool. It was her lifeline. The memory card inside held GPS data. If she could get it to work, it might lead her back to the main trail. Crawling over to the camera, she fumbled with the settings, her hands shaking. But as she powered it on, she froze. The lens had captured something she hadn't noticed before. She zoomed in, her stomach dropping. The shadowy figure was no animal. It was human, or at least it had been. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, its face obscured by a veil of darkness. And its eyes, Clara swore they were staring directly at her, even through the photograph. A low growl snapped her out of her trance. The wolf was back, its fur matted and streaked with dirt. It limped slightly but remained steadfast, standing guard over her. Clara felt a surge of relief, mixed with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, not knowing if the wolf could understand her words but hoping it could sense her sincerity. The forest grew unnervingly quiet, as if holding its breath. Clara knew she couldn't stay here. Whatever was out there wasn't going to wait forever. She looked at the wolf, its intelligent eyes meeting hers. "Lead me out," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please." The wolf seemed to understand. It turned and began to walk, pausing every few steps to ensure Clara was following. She clutched her camera tightly, her heart pounding as she trailed behind. The journey through the forest felt endless. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent her heart into overdrive. The wolf stayed close, occasionally pausing to growl at the unseen threat that seemed to stalk them. Clara's mind raced with questions. What was that thing? Why was the wolf protecting her? And how had she ended up in the middle of this nightmare? As they approached a clearing, Clara spotted something that made her heart leap. A wooden signpost. The trailhead. She was close to safety. But just as relief began to flood her, a guttural snarl echoed through the trees, louder and closer than before. The wolf bristled, its growl deep and menacing. Clara turned, her blood running cold. The shadow was back, and this time it wasn't hiding. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its distorted form flickering like a mirage. Clara's hands trembled as she raised her branch, knowing it was futile but unwilling to give up without a fight. The wolf lunged, its powerful body colliding with the shadow. Clara watched in horror as the two figures clashed, a blur of fur and darkness. She wanted to help, to do something, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. "Run!" A voice screamed in her mind. Whether it was hers or some primal instinct, she didn't know. Clutching her camera, she turned and sprinted toward the trailhead, tears streaming down her face. The sounds of the struggle faded behind her, replaced by the pounding of her heart and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Clara didn't stop until she saw her car, parked just where she'd left it. She threw herself into the driver's seat, locking the doors and fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, she dared a glance back at the forest. The wolf stood at the edge of the trees, battered but alive. Its eyes met hers one last time before it disappeared into the shadows. Clara drove away, her mind racing with unanswered questions. She didn't know what she'd just survived, but one thing was certain. She owed her life to the wolf. Clara leaned against the steering wheel, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her breath. The car's interior felt suffocating, her hands trembling on the key as the engine idled. Her mind raced with the events that had just unfolded. The wolf, the shadow, the unexplainable. How was she alive? And why did the wolf risk its life for her? She reached for her camera on the passenger seat, flipping through the photos she'd taken in the forest. As her thumb hovered over the buttons, she hesitated. Did she really want to see it again? The figure, its grotesque form, had etched itself into her memory. With a deep breath, Clara opened the image. There it was, the shadowy figure, its elongated limbs twisted unnaturally, its dark form blending into the background like smoke. But as she zoomed in, she noticed something she hadn't before. There was a mark on the figure's chest, a symbol faint but distinct. It looked like a spiral, encased in jagged lines, almost like a scar. Her stomach churned. Why did it feel familiar? A knock on the car window jolted her back to reality. She gasped, nearly dropping the camera. There was no one outside. She scanned the empty parking lot, her heart pounding. The forest loomed in the distance, its shadows stretching unnaturally in the daylight. Clara locked the doors, her fingers fumbling on the button. She told herself it was just her imagination, the aftermath of a terrifying ordeal. But deep down, she knew better. As she sat there, trying to gather her thoughts, a faint sound reached her ears, a distant howl. The wolf. No, she whispered, shaking her head. You're safe. You're out. Don't go back. But something about the howl didn't sit right. It wasn't a warning or a call. It was pain. Clara's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She tried to reason with herself. Going back into that forest was insanity. Whatever had been after her was still out there. The wolf had given her a chance to escape, and she owed it to herself, and to the wolf, not to waste it. Yet the sound tugged at her, a gnawing guilt settling in her chest. She couldn't leave it behind. Not after what it had done for her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud thud on the roof of the car. Clara froze, every muscle in her body tensing. The sound came again, heavier this time, as if something was moving across the metal. Don't look, she whispered to herself, her breath shaky. But curiosity got the better of her. She tilted her head up slowly, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. A shadow passed across the back window. Her pulse skyrocketed. She couldn't see its shape clearly, but the weight of its presence was palpable. Clara reached for the gear shift, her fingers trembling. If she could just drive. The radio crackled to life, the static loud and jarring. Clara jumped, her heart racing. She hadn't even touched it. Through the static, a distorted voice broke through. Help! Wolf! Danger! The words were barely audible, fragmented and warped. But they were enough. The voice wasn't human. It was too guttural, too fragmented to belong to anything she could understand. The weight on the car shifted, and Clara's instincts screamed at her to move. Slamming the gear into drive, she floored the accelerator. The tires screeched as the car lurched forward, throwing her back against the seat. She didn't dare look behind her as she sped out of the parking lot and onto the winding road leading away from the forest. Her chest heaved as she drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She told herself she was safe now, that whatever had been on her car was gone. But the radio crackled again, the same distorted voice cutting through. Return. The wolf. Clara's hands shook as she reached to turn the radio off, but the voice persisted, growing louder. Return, before it's too late. The car suddenly jolted, the engine sputtering as if something had gripped the wheels. Clara screamed, slamming her foot on the brake. The car skidded to a halt, the tires grinding against the gravel. For a moment there was silence. Clara's chest rose and fell as she stared out the windshield, her breath fogging the glass. The forest stretched ahead, its shadows beckoning her back. And then she saw it, a shape emerging from the treeline. At first, she thought it was the wolf, but as it stepped closer, her blood ran cold. It wasn't the wolf. The figure was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its movements jerky and deliberate. The spiral mark on its chest glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Clara's instincts screamed at her to run, but the car refused to start. She turned the key repeatedly, the engine groaning but refusing to catch. The figure drew closer, its hollow eyes locked on hers. It raised an elongated hand, pointing toward the forest. Return. The voice from the radio growled, this time coming from the creature itself. Clara's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She had a choice. Go back into the forest or face whatever this thing was. The wolf's howl echoed in the distance again, more urgent this time. Clara took a shaky breath, her decision already made. She opened the car door, her legs trembling as she stepped out. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it. For the wolf, for herself. She just hoped she wasn't walking into a trap. Clara stood at the edge of the forest, her chest heaving and legs trembling as she peered into the shadows. The towering trees seemed to lean toward her, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. That distant howl echoed again, sharper now, tinged with desperation. She clutched the camera in her hands like a lifeline, its strap digging into her wrist. Her heart pounded against her ribs as the ominous figure stepped closer, its distorted form radiating menace. The spiral mark on its chest glowed brighter, casting eerie patterns across the ground. "What do you want from me?" Clara demanded, her voice shaking but defiant. The creature didn't answer. Instead, it raised its elongated arm, pointing deeper into the forest. The message was clear. She had to go back. Summoning every ounce of courage, Clara stepped forward. The moment her foot crossed the threshold into the forest, the air shifted. The oppressive silence gave way to a low hum, like a heartbeat resonating through the earth. The creature melted into the shadows, vanishing as if it had never been there. Clara followed the sound of the wolf's howl, her every step heavy with dread. The deeper she ventured, the more surreal the forest became. The sunlight seemed to dim unnaturally, the trees casting shadows that danced and twisted like living things. She stopped abruptly when she saw the wolf. It lay in a small clearing, its fur matted with blood. Surrounding it were jagged stones etched with the same spiral symbol she'd seen on the creature. The wolf lifted its head weakly, its golden eyes locking onto hers. Clara's breath hitched as she knelt beside it. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll help you." The wolf let out a low whimper, its body trembling. As Clara reached out to touch its fur, the ground beneath her feet began to shake. The spirals on the stones lit up, their glow pulsating in rhythm with the strange hum in the air. Suddenly, the forest erupted in movement. Shadows poured from between the trees, coalescing into the monstrous figure she had seen before. This time, it wasn't alone. More shapes emerged, each one twisted and unnatural, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. Clara scrambled to her feet, placing herself between the wolf and the advancing creatures. "Stay back," she shouted, though her voice wavered. The lead figure stepped forward, its presence suffocating. "You were warned," it hissed, its voice a blend of static and whispers. Clara's grip on the camera tightened. She didn't know what she was doing or why she felt compelled to be there, but she couldn't abandon the wolf. "Why are you doing this? What does the wolf have to do with you?" The creature tilted its head, as if amused. "It is not the wolf we want," it rasped. "It is you." The words sent a chill down Clara's spine. Before she could react, the spirals on the stones flared, and the ground beneath her feet began to crack. Tendrils of darkness shot up, wrapping around her legs and pulling her downward. "No!" Clara screamed, struggling against the inky restraints. She looked to the wolf, its eyes glowing faintly as it forced itself to stand. Despite its injuries, it let out a guttural growl and lunged at the lead figure. The wolf's attack was ferocious, its teeth sinking into the creature's shadowy form. The figure screeched, its voice reverberating through the clearing. Clara took the opportunity to free herself, clawing at the tendrils until they released her. As the wolf fought valiantly, Clara noticed something. A crack forming in one of the glowing stones. She didn't know why, but instinct told her the stones were the key. She grabbed a nearby rock and smashed it against the glowing spiral. The effect was immediate. The moment the stone shattered, the creatures let out a collective wail. Their forms flickered like fading projections, their movements becoming sluggish. Encouraged, Clara moved to the next stone, smashing it with all her strength. With each stone destroyed, the creatures grew weaker, their forms dissolving into the shadows from which they came. The wolf continued to fight, its strength seemingly bolstered by Clara's actions. When the final stone cracked, the forest fell silent. The creatures were gone, their spirals extinguished. The wolf collapsed to the ground, its chest rising and falling rapidly. Clara rushed to its side, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me," she whispered, stroking its bloodied fur. "Thank you." The wolf's golden eyes met hers one last time. It let out a low, rumbling growl, one that sounded almost like a word. "Go." Before Clara could respond, the wolf's body shimmered, its form disintegrating into tiny specks of light that floated upward. She watched in stunned silence as the lights ascended, merging with the sunlight filtering through the trees. Clara sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of everything sinking in. When she finally stood, she realized the forest felt different. The oppressive air was gone, replaced by a serene stillness. As she walked back to her car, Clara glanced at the camera in her hands. She had captured something extraordinary, but she wasn't sure the world was ready to see it. One thing was certain. She would never forget the wolf that had saved her, or the unseen danger it had fought to protect her from. And as she drove away, she couldn't help but feel that the wolf was still watching over her, even from beyond. As Clara drove away from the forest, her mind replayed the events of the day like fragments of a dream. The wolf's golden eyes, the glowing spirals, the shadowy creatures. They felt surreal, yet the weight of it all pressed on her chest, reminding her it had been all too real. The wolf's final sacrifice lingered in her thoughts, a mix of gratitude and heartbreak swirling within her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the wolf wasn't just a protector but something far greater, a guardian bound to the forest and its mysteries. Clara pulled over to the side of the road and stepped out of her car, letting the cool breeze wash over her. She gazed at the distant treetops, now bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun. In that quiet moment, she realized the experience had changed her. For years, she'd carried the weight of regret and self-doubt, burying herself in her work and ignoring her instincts. But the wolf had shown her something profound: the importance of trust, courage, and connection. It had stood by her, fought for her, even when it could have turned away. Perhaps the wolf wasn't just protecting her from the creatures, but teaching her to face her fears, to fight for herself. Looking down at the camera in her hands, Clara smiled faintly. She knew she had a choice. She could use what she'd captured to share the story of bravery, resilience, and sacrifice, or keep it as a private reminder of the extraordinary bond she'd shared with the wolf. As she got back into her car, Clara whispered a quiet thank you to the wind, hoping it would somehow reach her guardian. The road ahead felt uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. And deep in the forest, beneath the dappled light, the spirit of the wolf watched over her still. What would you have done if you were in Clara's shoes? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Do you think the wolf was just a protector, or could it have been something more extraordinary? If this story gave you chills or made you think twice about the unseen forces around us, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales of mystery, courage, and the unknown. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We've got more spine-tingling adventures on the way. And don't forget to share this story with friends who love an emotional and suspenseful journey. Let's grow this community of thrill seekers together. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the mysteries of the world.